shadowed by the Iron Curtain, the Russian threat, by the failure to establish democracies in the Eastern European countries, and by the prevalence everywhere, intellectually, of these ideas of collectivism arising from the war. The argument always was that democracy is impossible without a free economy. You need a free economy. A free economy is a necessary, though not a sufficient condition for democracy.
The debates were passionate. At one point, Hayek's former mentor, Ludwig von Mises, stormed out of a meeting.
In the middle of a debate on the distribution of income, in which you had people who you would hardly call socialist or egalitarian, people like myself, Mises got up and said, "You're all a bunch of socialists," and walked right out of the room.
But Hayek told the meeting that they had one great lesson to learn from the socialists.
Hayek paid enormous tribute to the socialist intellectuals and said that the great strength of the socialists is that they had the courage, he said, to be idealistic, to have a theory, to have a project, to have a vision, and to go on working towards that through thick and thin.
As the meeting came to an end, Hayek predicted a long fight, a battle of ideas that might last 20 years or more before the world changed its mind. In the meantime, Hayek could see only one gleam of light. The war left Germany in ruins. Its economy had disintegrated. Markets had broken down. Shops were empty. Already the Russians occupied East Germany and were waiting for the rest to fall into their lap. In the American and British occupation zones, raging hyperinflation had made the German currency worthless. In the winter of 1948, the Allies appointed as Director of Economic Affairs a rotund, cigar-chomping economist named Ludwig Erhard. A staunch anti-Nazi, Erhard was a free market economist who shared many of Hayek's beliefs and ideas. He also believed the Allies' economic rules were making a bad situation worse.
The occupying authorities had imposed a system under which there were extensive wage and price controls, supposedly to control inflation. But of course, wage and price controls never control inflation. And you had essentially an economy that was brought to a halt.
In dieser Situation
In this situation, the black markets formed,
und auf dem schwarzen Markt
and American cigarettes were its form of currency.
amerikanische Zigarette.
And nobody smoked cigarettes. They were for small transactions. Cognac was a medium of circulation for large transactions.
The Allies introduced a new currency, the Deutschmark, to replace the worthless German money. But for Erhard, that was not enough. So, without informing the Allies, Erhard went on the radio and made a startling announcement.
Ludwig Erhard, legendary man, he decided without asking anybody and against the will of the American occupation powers, he decided to give up all price controls.
Next day, General Lucius Clay, the man in charge of occupied Germany, demanded to know what Erhard thought he was doing.
Was haben Sie?
Clay said, "What have you done? You've changed the Allied price controls."
Und Erhard antwortete dann, oh,
Erhard replied, "Herr General, I haven't changed them. I've abolished them."
und Klee sagte dann,
And Clay said, "My advisors tell me it's a big mistake."
es ein Fehler gewesen sei. Dann sagte Erhard,
Erhard replied, "Herr General, My advisors tell me the same thing.
Sagen mir das gleich.
Overnight, the black market disappeared. People stopped hoarding, and goods not seen for 10 years went on sale.
It started the markets working with free prices. Instead of nothing being in the windows of the shops, everything started to come up. And that began the German economic era.
Germany's social market economy combined free markets with a strong welfare state. Within a few years, Germany's social market economy overtook Britain's more planned economy. But back then, nobody wanted to model themselves on Germany. Most countries prefer to plan their economies. India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, the very symbol of imperialism, celebrated its freedom. Mahatma Gandhi was the father of independence. His economic ideal was a simple India of self-sufficient villages. Pandit Nehru, the first Prime Minister, wanted to industrialize and combine British parliamentary democracy with Soviet-style central planning.
In the 1950s, India was the mecca of all economists. You talk of any economist in the world, and they were advising the Indian government. And the advice was, you must have a state-led model of industrial growth. The public sector must occupy what came to be called the commanding heights of the economy. And that's why steel, coal, machine tools, capital goods, all the areas of heavy industry were in the public sector and not in the private sector.
Nehru put his faith in technology.
Nehru was a rational thinker, and he wanted to apply science and technologies to solve the great mass poverty that prevailed at the time of independence.
Under Nehru, central planning became a form of science.
Nehru was always recruiting intellectuals in India on his side in the cause of planning. And there was this genius statistician, Mahalanobis, who was head of the Indian Statistical Institute.
Nehru asked Mahalanobis to think about how to plan an economy. The brilliant Mahalanobis succeeded in expressing the entire Indian economy in a single mathematical formula.
Let YT equal national income, CT equal consumption, and KT equal investment at time into open bracket 1 plus lambda k beta k close bracket minus 1 are fractions of investment allocated to industries producing capital goods, that is K sector, and consumer goods, that is C sector respectively. We shall write.
People believed this perfect mathematical model could be applied in a less than perfect world.
And at that time, Mahalanobis' model was hailed as one of the pioneering mathematical models for planning in a mixed economy. And that made Mahalanobis very influential.
India became the model of economic development for newly independent nations. Across the developing world, socialism, planning, government control, regulation, and ownership, these became the gospel. All over Africa, people looked to socialism to lead them out of poverty. Across South America, governments chose state control as the way to modernize. The apparent success of communist countries like the Soviet Union and China seemed to show the way. By 1950, Hayek's market economics were so completely out of fashion that when he sought a full-time academic job in the United States, only one university was willing to hire him.
Chicago has always been an exceptional place, out of the mainstream. Chicago is geographically isolated. This affects Chicago's intellectual influence in many more areas than economics.
The University of Chicago's intellectual influence would grow. 8 professors and another 11 economists from Chicago went on to win Nobel Prizes. Gary Becker is one of them.
When I came as a graduate student to Chicago in 1951, I was flabbergasted by how stimulating the atmosphere was. I had been a very good student at Princeton. My first day in Friedman's class, he raised a question, I answered, he said, "That's no answer, that's just rephrasing the question." That was the example of how blunt people were.
Nobody was very polite. And people were interested in ideas and argument, and not in making sure you didn't ruffle anybody's feathers.
If you're sitting in a seminar room and somebody up there is saying something, which if imbibed by your students who are sitting in that same room, is going to lead them astray, it's up to you to call that guy right now, and not later. And that, I think, is sort of the spirit that prevailed in the Chicago workshop system. There wasn't that much fighting in the lunches. They were pretty cordial.
Lunches at the Quadrangle Club were famous for the intensity of intellectual discussion. And one man came to dominate those debates.
Somehow Milton managed to set the agenda of argument. And so there was a saying, everybody loves to argue with Milton, particularly when he isn't there, because he's a good arguer.
Milton Friedman was becoming the most articulate spokesman for the so-called Chicago School of Economics.
The Chicago School meant was a strong belief in minimal government and an emphasis on free market as a way to control the economy.
You know, in many ways, Milton Friedman was a devil figure in my youth in a Keynesian household of economists because he seemed, with his emphasis on individualism, freedom, and markets, to be so unconcerned with fairness.
Liberals may have loathed the Chicago School, but Hayek felt on home ground in an intellectual atmosphere so like the Vienna of his youth.
Our vision is that the forces of the market are just that. They are forces. They are like the wind and the tides. If you want to try to ignore them, you ignore them at your peril. If you find a way of ordering your life which harnesses these forces to the benefit of your society, that's the way to go.
But in Washington, Keynes was still king of the hill. 19 years after he died, his face was on the cover of Time magazine.
Keynes's influence on economics at mid-century can't be exaggerated. The economic advice that economists gave to policymakers said the only reason you have bad economic outcomes is because the government's not doing enough. It sounds almost like central planning, doesn't it?
Washington's Keynesians saw the economy not as a force of nature, but a sophisticated machine to be fine-tuned by technocrats like themselves. The Keynesian consensus was summed up when that most Ivy League of presidents, John Kennedy, received an honorary degree from Yale.
It might be said now that I have the best of both worlds, a Harvard education and a Yale degree.
For JFK, Keynes had won the argument. The battle of ideas was over.
What is at stake in our economic decisions today is not some grand warfare of rival ideologies which will sweep the country with passion, but the practical management of a modern economy. What we need is not labels and cliches, but more basic discussion of the sophisticated and technical questions involved in keeping a great economic machinery moving ahead.
Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisers had drafted his speech along Keynesian lines.
We thought it was a great day when Kennedy decided to give that speech at Yale and to talk about economic policy. That speech suggested that we had won over Kennedy. We had won the heart and mind of the president.
For what came to be known as the 30 Glorious Years, Keynesian economics had been delivering the goods. Europe, Japan, and America all saw high economic growth and rising standards of living. People enjoyed a prosperity undreamed of at the end of the war. When Hayek moved back to his native Austria, he was depressed. The success of mixed economies made his free market theories, and Hayek himself, seem more irrelevant than ever.
The world was very much a socialist world. His ideas were not fashionable. Nobody seemed to listen to him. Nobody seemed to agree with him. He was alone.
Hayek found his ideas shunned by the academic world.
Well, most of the departments came to dislike me, so much so that I can feel it to the present day. That economists are very largely tend to treat me as an outsider.
He was living in a provincial town and stuck in a rut. But the outside world was beginning to change. Skimming the newspaper in his usual restaurant, Hayek read how inflation and unemployment were rising at the same time. There was a new word to describe it: stagflation. After 30 glorious years of growth, the American economy was in trouble.
The economy basically was kind of going nowhere and had inflation, which didn't seem to get cured, and kind of a malaise in the economy.
Stagflation was the end of naive Keynesianism. You had two things at the same time, which under the Keynesian view would have been impossible. You had stagnation in the economy, a high level of unemployment. You had inflation with prices rising rapidly.
President Nixon looked like a Chicago economist's dream come true. Milton Friedman was a special advisor. and George Shultz was in charge of the budget.
The wholesale price index a moment ago. One of the big areas where prices were going up at wholesale very rapidly was lumber and other materials associated with home building.
But the president wasn't listening. He tried to spend his way out of trouble.
Going to wind up having its impact on the cost.
To add insult to injury, he declared, "Now I'm a Keynesian."
This declaration by Nixon horrified his conservative supporters. Indeed, one congressman wrote him, said, "Mr. President, I'm going to have to burn all of my old speeches." And Nixon wrote back to him, "I will too."
Nixon decided he hadn't gone far enough. So he took his top economic advisors off to Camp David for a working weekend. Ben Stein, the quiz show host, was a junior speechwriter in the White House, and his father was at the meeting.
Here's my father walking into the president's cabin to meet Mr. Nixon, and there's George Shultz right behind him. I'm not sure, but I think it's a fair bet that in any one of these meetings, they're complaining about something being wrong. Probably talking about prices and stagflation. I'm not sure.
Dick Cheney was a young aide at the time.
I always remember a debate we had during the Nixon administration, when the public was convinced that food prices were going up. So the political debate was whether or not we should impose a freeze on food prices.
The supposedly conservative Republican Nixon opted for wage and price controls.
Nixon was a great one for doing something. I think, in retrospect, we now know it would have been better to do nothing, but he was in favor of doing something.
I was there, and I opposed them. Wage and price controls, you could see analytically, would get you in a lot of trouble.
Time has come for a new economic policy for the United States. Its targets are unemployment, inflation.
At one point, President Nixon spoke up and quoted Nikita Khrushchev. And he said, "Khrushchev once told me that sometimes in order to be a statesman, you have to be a politician for a while."
Problem with him was that he was willing to sacrifice principle too easily for political advantage.
The voters liked the president's war on prices. Nixon was reelected in a landslide. The economy did less well.
Right away, the economy went out of whack. People couldn't cover their costs. Ranchers stopped sending cattle to market. Farmers started drowning their chickens. Instead of controlling inflation, they were creating shortages.
And prices just kept on rising.
The last time I saw Nixon in the Oval Office was George Shultz. President Nixon said to me, "Don't blame George for this silly business of wage and price control," meaning George Shultz. And I said to him, "Oh no, Mr. President, I don't blame George. I blame you."
Britain's mixed economy, so widely imitated, was in similar trouble. It too was facing the deadly combination of unemployment and inflation. In theory, the Conservative Prime Minister Ted Heath and his cabinet believed in markets. In practice, like Nixon, they made a sharp U-turn and used wage and price controls to combat stagflation.
I was a junior minister in Ted Heath's government, and I remember having to attend meetings with 3 or 4 other ministers where we would actually decide the level of charges plumbers could charge next week to repair taps, and how much taxi drivers could charge for fares, and how much hairdressers should get in wages. It was absolutely unbelievable. It all came to a very sticky end, a complete collapse.
A coal miners' strike and an oil crisis plunged the country into darkness. Voters blamed Ted Heath and voted the Conservatives out of office.
Well, we're virtually out of business while the power's off. We've got no sets that we can operate at all.
We were the sick man of Europe, and the English disease was the disease of strikes, which we had all over the place. And you know, it was so bad that Herman Kahn of the Hudson Institute wrote a book called The Year 2000. And he saw many things, but the one thing he did see was that the lower standard of living in Europe in the year 2000 would be shared between Albania and the United Kingdom. Albania.
A minister in the defeated government, Keith Joseph may have been an unworldly intellectual, but his search for fresh answers would change the way not only Britain, but the world thought about economics and society.
Keith wore a hair shirt. He beat his breast and said, we were to blame. We've got it wrong. And he did beat his breast. He was called a mad monk.
I thought I was a conservative. But all the time I was in favour of shortcuts to utopia. I was in favour of the government doing things because I was so impatient for good things to be done.
And when he appeared on television, he had a vein in his head which kept throbbing. And people said, oh, this is a very strange figure indeed, this man.
It's only to be expected.
But nonetheless, he started the rethink of conservative policy.
Keith Joseph's search brought him here, where, with Hayek's encouragement, a group of kindred spirits had set up a think tank called the Institute of Economic Affairs.
The Institute started in 1957, you could say, as a direct result of the Montpellier Society, of the Road to Serfdom, of Hayek's ideas of freedom and competitive enterprise.
With the zeal of a convert, Joseph began to preach the virtues of free markets. In a series of pamphlets, he went on the intellectual offensive, attacking the mixed economy, making the case for capitalism. Mark Garnett is a biographer of Keith Joseph.
From the middle of 1974, Joseph undertakes a crusade to convert the country to his way of thinking. And what he wants to do is to take the battle to the heart of the enemy camp. And he believed that the universities were infected with socialist thinking.
It was a free society in this country,
and he was going right into the lion's den, arguing a case that many people had never heard before.
Joseph felt that it was his duty to fight back on behalf of the free market.
To revive the economy, Joseph preached that Britain needed more risk-taking, which meant more bankrupts and more millionaires, and less equality.
The audience would sort of gasp. They'd never heard anybody challenging the consensus.
Mild inflation seemed the painless way of maintaining full employment, encouraging growth, and expanding social services. So the result is that we're now more socialist in many ways than any other developed country outside the communist bloc.
He used to be snubbed in the back door. He was genuinely hurt that the students had reacted to this penetrating argument by chucking flower bombs at him.
It was almost a badge of honour that he would come away from these meetings with egg yolk running down his suit.
Keith Joseph's most significant adherent was an up-and-coming conservative politician named Margaret Thatcher. In Parliament and politics, Thatcher's closest friends agree that Keith Joseph's influence on her was crucial.
She relied on him to give her deep intellectual support. There's nothing wrong with intuition. Intuition is reason in a hurry. And Keith just supported and reinforced her intuition at the very moment she needed that support.
Margaret Thatcher had a gut instinct for market economics. Her father had been a grocer, and when she was a girl, she had helped him in the shop. Hard-working and studious, she won a place at Oxford University, where she became interested in student politics. While she was at Oxford, she read Hayek's Road to Serfdom. It made a lasting impression on her. Years later, when she became the first woman to lead the Conservative Party, she once slammed Hayek's book down on a table and announced, "This is what we believe."
Thatcher's office came on and said, could she come and drop in to see him? And so she called by, and there was a period of unaccustomed silence for Margaret Thatcher as she sat there, intense, attending to the master's words.
By 1974, Hayek sensed the world beginning to go his way.
So far as the movement of intellectual opinion is concerned, it is now, for the first time in my life, moving in the right direction.
In the battle of ideas, 1974 was a turning point. Hayek's Nobel Prize came as a surprise, but the balance was now shifting away from Keynes and towards Hayek.
I'd like to say that when I was a young man, only the very old men still believed in a free market system. When I was in my middle ages, almost I myself and nobody else believed in it. And now I have the pleasure of having lived long enough to see that the young people believe again in it. And that is a very important change.
The U.S. economy is going through the worst downturn since the Great Depression. Industry slowed. Unemployment rose. The Yom Kippur War was followed by an Arab oil embargo. Americans waited in gas lines, and the price of everything kept rising. Chicago school economists had always argued that rigid government regulations were keeping prices high and fueling inflation. Now more people began to wonder if competition could break the inflationary stranglehold.
What is the effect of regulating the airlines? What is the effect of regulating the trucking industry? And what is the effect of regulating the railroad industry? Very often it raises prices. Instead of allowing competition, it suppresses competition.
In 1962 of Juliet, 9-126.enter. Unit 43W, runway 32 left at Mike. Clear left, join Bravo, to Mike 2 at 19
In the airline industry, the host of regulations enacted during the Great Depression were still in force. It was a classic example of regulated capitalism, but deregulation was in the air. Stephen Breyer, now a Supreme Court Justice, then a Harvard professor, was asked by liberal Democratic Senator Ted Kennedy to head a Senate investigation of airline regulations.
You discovered that basically the same firms that had been there in 1938 were still there. Those are the major carriers, and nobody knew.
The hearings began, and officials from the Civil Aeronautics Board were called to testify.
And it turned out that 5% of their time went to stop prices that were too high, and 95% of their time went to stop prices that were too low. But always the effort was to keep the price high and not low.
Naturally, the established airlines were quite happy with this arrangement.
We'd say, when was the last time you granted a new route? Well,
regulations meant that major carriers like Pan Am never had to compete with newcomers. But some cut-price charter flight operators wanted to break this club. Leading the struggle against Pan Am over its profitable transatlantic flights was an exuberant Englishman called Freddie Laker.
I'm Freddie Laker. I own Laker Airways, and I'm dedicated to low-cost air travel. With Laker, you can fly round trip to the USA or Canada in one of our wide-body DC-10s for less than half the price of a normal economy ticket. Look, I've got to give you a better deal. I've got my name on every plane.
And the Transportation Department said that this may hurt Pan Am. And Freddie Laker testified and said, the cause of this whole thing is Panamania. So we said, what is that? And he said, well, everybody should do everything for Pan Am.
The man who was to sweep away airline regulations is a lifelong Gilbert and Sullivan fan. Improbably enough, the bearded poet is played by Fred Kahn, a professor at Cornell University. Kahn wanted a leaner, meaner regulatory environment in which the market was free to chase profits without the dead weight of bloated government. Democratic President Jimmy Carter made Kahn head of the Civil Aeronautics Board. Kahn had spent years studying government regulation. Now he had a chance to do something about it.
And when I got to the Civil Aeronautics Board, the biggest division under me was the Division of Enforcement. In effect, FBI agents who would go around and seek out secret discounts and then impose fines. We would discipline them. It was illegal to compete in price. That means it was illegal to compete in the discounts you offer travel agents. So we regulated travel agents' discounts. Internationally, since they couldn't cut rates, they competed by having more and more sumptuous meals. We actually regulated the size of sandwiches.
By the time Kahn had finished, the CAB had nothing left to do but close itself down.
Competition's the rule, and because of it, the consumers are better served than ever.
Airline deregulation led to painful turbulence as new carriers came and went. Like her father, Judith Hamill works in the airline industry.
My dad was a jet mechanic with Braniff. At the age of 59, he found that his skills were no longer desirable or needed. And when Braniff came back, because of the duty to hire, he came back at half the salary that he had made before. When you give your life and you live by the rules and then the rules change, it's sad.
But 20 years later, the industry was employing 2 times as many people to fly almost 3 times as many passengers.
The industry vastly underestimated the demand for airfare at lower prices. And what's happened is that as the prices went down, demand went up dramatically.
And once they were free to compete, you began to get Super Saver fares, and Super Apex fares, and potato fares, and peanuts fares. And so, an explosion of discounting and competition. Well, those were dramatic.
The The stage was set for deregulation of the U.S. economy. And now these ideas were about to make their entrance in the very homeland of Gilbert and Sullivan.
Well, 5% no good to nobody, is it?
Do you think you can win this strike?
Yes, I do.
They called it the Winter of Discontent. It seemed as if everyone was on strike.
I think it stinks like all the other damn strikes in this country run by the filthy socialist communist unions.
The garbage men were out. So were the ambulances. And if you died, the gravediggers were out too. With the economy in apparently terminal decline, the people voted for a new conservative government, headed by Margaret Thatcher.
Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister on the day of my father's birthday. So he sent her this telegram from Freiburg. Thank you for the best present to my 80th birthday that anyone could have given me. And a few days later, she wrote back from 10 Downing Street. Dear Professor Hayek, I'm very proud to have learned so much from you over the past few years. I am determined that we should succeed. If we do so, your contribution to our ultimate victory will have been immense. Yours sincerely, Margaret Thatcher.
And I'll strive unceasingly to try to fulfill the trust and confidence that the British people have placed in me and the things in which I believe.
Determined, and some said strident, she would revolutionize the economy.
The spirit of enterprise had been sat upon for years by socialism, by too high tax, by too high regulation, by too high public expenditure. The philosophy was nationalization, centralization, control, regulation. Now this had to end.
Thatcher squeezed government spending and cut subsidies to business. Thousands of bankruptcies and higher unemployment followed. Many saw her as uncaring. Britain had rarely been so divided. Thatcher had no time for conventional Keynesian economists who urged her to use government money to lessen the pain.
Although 364 economists wrote to the Times and said this is outrageous, you'll put us into a deep depression from a recession, 364 were wrong and the half dozen who supported us were right.
Those who urge us to relax the squeeze, to spend yet more money indiscriminately in the belief that will help the unemployed and the small businessman, are not being kind or compassionate or caring. I have only one thing to say. You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
In Britain, the battle lines were drawn. In America, the fight was already underway. Things were at a low point in the United States. President Carter spoke of malaise and loss of confidence in the country. Revolution in Iran had led to a second oil shock, and Americans held hostage in Tehran. Despite the beginning of deregulation, inflation was still at record heights. Carter's attempts to follow Keynes' formula and spend his way out of trouble were going nowhere.
Jimmy Carter was maybe the high point of Keynesian behavior, and it simply was not working.
Toward the end of the Carter administration, with inflation out of control,
Paul Volcker was made chairman of the Federal Reserve. He understood the problems.
I'm grateful to Paul Volcker for being willing now to accept the oath of office and then the responsibilities as chairman of the Federal Reserve System of our country. Paul.
Paul Volcker was steeped in the ideas of Austrian school economics.
It's obvious to all of you from what's been said today that we're face to face with really unique economic difficulties.
Volcker believed that inflation was one of the worst of all economic evils.
It came to be considered part of Keynesian doctrine that a little bit of inflation is a good thing. And of course, what happens then, you get a little bit of inflation, then you need a little more. If it peps up the economy, people get used to it, it loses its effectiveness like an antibiotic. You need a new one, you need a new one. And we certainly thought that inflation was a dragon that was eating at our innards, so the eagle was to slay that dragon.
Volcker used a blunt weapon. He tightened the money supply. The economy went into a nosedive. Facing a presidential election, Carter was reluctant to back such harsh measures. Carter's rival was the Republican Ronald Reagan. Reagan shared the same economic philosophy as Margaret Thatcher. For over 20 years, he had been campaigning against the Keynesian orthodoxy and for Hayek and Friedman's ideas of free markets and freedom.
Reagan knew Hayek personally. He knew Milton Friedman personally. And Reagan was, in a sense, their popularizer. So he was the person who could take these people who were very profound but not very easy to communicate. I mean, I don't think you'd ever get Hayek on the Today Show. But you could get Reagan explaining the core of Hayek with better examples in a more understandable language.
Vote for me if you believe in yourself. If you believe in your right to control your own destiny and plan your own life. Yes, and have to say with the spending of your own money.
The president is going to have more government on the backs of the people and of business and of industry and the working people in order to try to solve the problems that were created by too much government on our backs. We can get government off our backs, out of our pockets. This kind of indifference to economic disaster must be ended, and it'll be ended by having a different kind of...
The American people voted for change, and Reagan became president.
Situation was this. The only way you could get the inflation down was by having monetary contraction. There was no way you could do that without having a temporary recession.
Obviously, who wants a recession? But I can remember President Reagan using those famous words. If not now, when? If not us, who?
Reagan offered Volcker his moral support in the fight against inflation. As Volcker tightened the money supply, the economy slowed and contracted. Unemployment hit 10%. Nobody had realized quite how tough it would be. All across the heartland of America, ordinary people were hurting.
Well, the interest rates, that eats up all your profit. It becomes very difficult to keep your business running right. 1980s, the interest rates were up to 20% or better. It was very interesting times. I remember, cash flows got very tight. As things got tighter and tougher, creditors forced sales. Come up with the cash or we're going to have to liquidate you. It's a hole that almost seems impossible that you can get out of.
If you had told me in August of 1979 with interest rates, the prime rate would get to 21.5%, I probably would have crawled into a hole. Would have crawled into a hole and cried, I suppose, but we lived through it.
It had taken 3 years. 3 years of growing public anger. 3 years of real hardship for millions of Americans. But by 1982, the dragon of inflation had been slain.
What changed drastically in the 1980s and running through today is the kind of presumption that inflation is bad. The primary job of a central bank is to prevent inflation. That's a very different environment than the 50s and 60s.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Reagan and Volcker had set the United States on a new economic course.
From our very first day, we've been working to undo the economic wreckage they left behind.
They called his policy Reaganomics. It had 4 key elements.
The first was the concept of sound money. The second was deregulation. The third was modest tax rates. And the fourth was limited government spending. Sounds pretty conventional now, but when Reagan was elected, he was vilified by his opponents as being some radical extremist.
They just can't accept that their discredited policies of tax and tax, spend and spend, are at the root of our current problems.
Reagan's tax cuts, the biggest in history, led to huge deficits.
Our program has only been in effect for some time.
But the economy started to grow steadily again.
There's no doubt in my mind that those actions of Reagan, lowering tax rates, plus his emphasis on deregulating, unleashed the basic constructive forces of the free market. And from 1983 on, it's been almost entirely up.
Okay, we stop here. Atlantic Ocean. Alright, so there's a homework, and so you have watched the majority of this film, and if you want to watch it again, and you can go to the PBS, just Google the Commanding Heights and the vital ideas, and you will be able to find it, watch it again. And I want you to write a 1 page and about what you have learned from this. Okay? And turn it in on Monday, this weekend. Okay, 1 page, just what you learned. Okay?